sea and to the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man, sending
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Hadith Principles. This is a class where we talk about the study of the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And we have our panel. We have Brother Ayman and Ilyas. Both of them are from the United States. And we have Brother Muhammad Guma from Egypt. Inshallah, welcome, brothers. Inshallah, I hope this is interesting for you and enlightening for all of us, inshallah, bidnillah. In some previous episodes, we were talking about the Hadith in its relationship to the Quran. That the Hadith is also providing us revelation and guidance from Allah. The Prophet's role was to explain to us the message of Islam and to command us, and we're supposed to obey the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And we talked about the different kinds of things that are called hadith or sunnah. That is the Prophet's words, his action, his taqreer, or whatever he approved of and did not disapprove of, as well as the description of the Prophet Muhammad, his characteristics, his character or his physical characteristics, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him. Now, the hadith didn't just like pop out of nowhere, or come down from the sky. The hadith studies developed over a period of time for specific reasons. And so the principles that we're going to be studying about in this class were developed by our scholars for understanding the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So there are actually different stages in history where you see a development of this science. And you see that in every Islamic discipline or science, the tafsir or interpretation of the Quran, the fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence and practice, as well as in the study of the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Today I want to talk about the first stage, the initial stage in hadith study, and that is in the stage of the Sahaba. The Sahaba are the companions, those who were Muslims in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad and saw him and witnessed him. And that lasts basically up until the end of the first century of Islam. So about a little over 100 years. It actually starts before the year one, because the year one started after the 13 years of the revelation of the Quran. And so that stage is about 113 years long, give or take. And Allah knows best. There are certain characteristics of the stage of the companions. Number one is before Islam, as well as after they had become Muslims, the Sahaba had a strong tradition of memorization. They had an oral tradition. They passed down teachings and literature orally. They memorized poetry and sayings from previous generations, and they taught that to each other orally. They also kept written documents, but the majority of the Arabs were illiterate. They were simple people. They were ummiyun. They were very simple, and very few of them were learned in reading, writing, and arithmetic. As we say in America, we call that the 3 R's, which not all of them start with R's, but it's our own little joke that we say. And so the Sahaba were not, except a few of them, they were not experts in reading, writing, or arithmetic. They had a strong tradition of memorizing, and they took that before Islam. They did that, and so it was natural for them to continue that after Islam. And so they had an easy ability to memorize things, and it was a tradition in their society to do that, and then to teach that exactly. And so it was a tradition, and people were used to seeing somebody as a great person if they could pass down things they had memorized to others. So they had memorized huge reams of poetry that was very long and complex, and that was their way of distinguishing themselves in the society. So they carried that into the Islam by listening carefully to the Prophet's words, memorizing them, and then carrying them to other people in his lifetime as well as after his lifetime. Of course, secondly, the Sahaba had a strong religious commitment. What distinguishes them from other generations is their strong faith, their sacrifices. Not that other Muslims don't have strong faith and commitment to Islam, but as a whole, that generation gave everything 100% as much as they could. And so there were many, many hundreds or thousands of companions who had a strong religious commitment, a deep willingness to learn the religion and then apply it. And so if I'm committed to something, say for example, I want to learn carpentry, I want to learn how to build houses. So I go find a carpenter and I work with him, and I basically become his apprentice. I look what he does and I learn from him. The carpenter doesn't really necessarily have to tell me things. I can imitate him and follow him because I'm committed to learning that. And so I become, after a short time, without going to school and taking any classes, I become an expert in carpentry by staying and working with a carpenter who knows what he's doing. So because of their commitment, they stayed with the Prophet, they looked at everything he did and listened to him carefully, and they followed him and they imitated his behavior. Another characteristic in that stage, the stage of the Sahaba, was the Prophet's own careful educational effort, peace be upon him. That is, he was very meticulous in how he instructed the companions. He wasn't careless about it. In one of the hadiths, Aisha, his wife, narrates, the Prophet did not quote the hadith one after another as you do, yani sarada, the hadith kasardukum. He didn't simply make a long hadith one after another, but rather he would speak clearly and distinctly. Bayin fasl. He would talk carefully. So now you will hear hadith and they will say this hadith and that hadith and other, but instead the Prophet would talk very carefully and explain the meaning, make the meaning very clear and distinct, so the person who was sitting with him could easily memorize it. This is found in one of the important collections of the Sunan called At-Tirmidhi. Also, the beginning of that hadith is found in Sahih Bukhari. And in Bukhari and Muslim, Aisha also says, he used to limit it to a few hadith at a time. And very often, the Prophet would only speak and limit his speech. He didn't give long lectures, so the Sahaba could learn a few sayings of the Prophet at a time. He also, in Sahih Bukhari, he used to repeat things 3 times. So he would say the same thing you just said a minute ago, he would say it again. And then he would repeat it a 3rd time. And that's a real wisdom in educating people, repetition. And so sometimes you try to find the same thing and you find different ways to repeat that to people, and then you will remember it. And so the Prophet had very careful educational techniques for the Sahaba. So that was something important in that stage. Also, some of the Sahaba could write and did write down the hadith. In Sahih al-Bukhari, one of the most authentic collections, Abu Huraira, one of the Sahaba companions, he said, no one memorized more hadith than I did. That's because he was a poor guy and he spent all of his time in the mosque, day and night. He had nothing better to do, and so he worked hard to memorize the hadith of the Prophet. He said, nobody memorized more than me except Abdullah ibn Amr. And Abdullah ibn Amr used to write it down, but I didn't write. So he had to rely on his strong memory. And Abu Huraira had a phenomenal memory, but Abdullah ibn Amr had another thing, because he had the pen and he was able to record the hadith. And so if he forgot one, he could look to his notes and remind himself of the hadiths he had written down from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so he used to write the hadith. In fact, Abdullah ibn Amr himself says, I used to write everything I heard from the Prophet. Then some of Quraysh, that is some of Sahaba from Quraysh, the clan of the Prophet Muhammad, said to him, you shouldn't write everything, because sometimes somebody says something out of anger, and sometimes they say something when they're happy and pleased. And so he said, then I stopped writing the hadiths. So he mentioned that to the Prophet Muhammad, And the Prophet said, no. The Prophet said, "Uktub, فَوَالَّذِي نَفْسِي بِيَدِهِ مَا يَخْرُجُ مِنْهُ." He pointed to his mouth, إِلَّا الْحَقِّ. He said, no, write, because I swear by the one in whose hands my soul lies. That is, I swear by Allah, in whose hands is the soul of the Prophet. Nothing comes out of this, my mouth, except for the truth. So the Prophet never spoke by the hawa, as Allah said in the Quran, but only what was revealed to him by his Lord. So he had no problem. If the Prophet was angry at somebody, he never said a lie when he was angry. He only said the truth, even when he was angry or upset, even when he's joking. So we tell a joke, and we say something that's not really true in the joke, but it's just a joke. It's not meant to be taken literally. But the Prophet, even when he was joking, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he only told the truth. So he would make little jokes about somebody, about their characteristics and their behavior, but he wouldn't ever lie in any case. So the Prophet was directly ordering Abdullah bin Amr to write down the hadith, and don't worry about writing down anything the Prophet said or did. There are so many hadiths talking about the writing of the hadith by the Sahaba that they are what we call to the level of tawatur, which means they are numerous hadiths, so many, coming from so many of the Sahaba, and from the Sahaba to many of the next generation who lived in all different countries of the world. It would have been impossible for them to all get together and forge something. So they all agreed that the Prophet used to write. But there are also some hadith that say you shouldn't write the hadith. And this is confusing to people. And so in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet said, do not write anything about me except for the Quran. So whoever wrote anything beside the Quran should erase that or wipe it. And from this, we will learn that the hadith were at one stage not to be written along with the Quran. And at a later stage, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, allowed them to be written. We'll go for a break and we'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Tech Talk. We're going to look how to create a website and which Islamic websites to actually visit. What inspired you to create your own website?
One of the challenges that we face every day, the site or the application should be accessible worldwide. I remember when I was younger, one of my friends asked me to convince his father to get him a desktop, even the laptop. If you compared both of them in terms of cost, laptop roughly cost twice the money if you compare it with the desktop.
Hackers, the word hackers, most of the youth people are very interested about that word. They say, hey, I'd like to be a hacker, because there is a type of hacker doing great job. We call them white hat hacker.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Hadith Principles. Before the break, we're talking about the initial stage in the study of Hadith, which was the stage in the lifetime of the companions, the Sahaba. Basically, the first century in Islamic history until the last of the companions died shortly into the second century, around 110, all of them had passed away. May Allah be pleased with them. And so we talked about some characteristics of this stage. I don't know if you guys remember some of those characteristics, but let's remember them. Some of the stage one is the stage of whom? Stage of the companions, the Sahaba, those who witnessed the Prophet. And they had special characteristics. And these characteristics meant that they were specially qualified to preserve the hadith for us. Can any of you guys remember some of them that I said?
The memory, the familial memory of the companions.
They had a strong oral tradition. They had good memories. Before Islam, they used to memorize. And some of them also wrote, and the Prophet gave them permission to write. So they weren't all illiterate. Umar ibn Khattab, we already said Muhammad ibn Amr, he wrote Arabic and Syriac. As did Omar, the second Khalifa, he wrote Arabic and Syriac. Some more.
The Prophet's special style in learning, Hadith, that
Yeah.
he has to repeat, repetition.
Yeah, the Prophet was very careful in his education. Peace and blessing be upon him. Had educational techniques. And so he was very careful to teach them, to repeat frequently, to not go on too long. And they were also, one more, they were very committed. They were very committed to Islam. And so a person who is committed to a subject is going to be careful to learn from the expert. So if my major, some people, we take a major in school, for example. My parents want me to be a doctor, but I'm not that interested. So I go and I do the minimum, I study what I have to do, and I take the test. But some people, they're committed to medicine. They believe in it. So when they have an opportunity and they meet a famous physician, famous expert, then they're going to follow him, ask lots of questions, learn from that person. They're going to take that person, as they call him, a mentor, right? And model themselves after that. So we all know people who have mentors or are mentors. And that's how the companions were with the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. So that stage has its unique characteristics that really made it possible for us to receive the hadith in correct form. People like that generation were the perfect people to convey the hadith to us in the form where they heard it, inshallah. Yes?
Sheikh, I have a question. Can you maybe elaborate on the importance of adhering firmly to the sunnah? Because nowadays, people like to follow, people are attached to their customs and traditions, and if they hear something about the sunnah that contradicts it, they'll say, well, it's only sunnah, I don't have to do it. And or it's, iman is in the heart and it's not in appearance or actions.
MashaAllah. As the Prophet said, alaykum bis sunnati. You must follow sunnah. And he said, Udu alayha, grasp firmly with nawadij, with your teeth, hold on strongly. You can imagine, you're falling off the boat into the ocean, and they throw you a rope and you catch it with your teeth, and that's how hard you have to hold on to the sunnah. The Prophet warned us that in later years of the world, there are going to be conditions that a lot of things are not following the sunnah, and then we're going to have to grasp hard to it. He said sometime following the sunnah will be like holding a hot coal. And so we have an extra reward in our era. And so the Sahaba, they had the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They experienced that. But we're following him without having the pleasure of being with him in person, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so we have an extra reward from Allah. We didn't meet him, but we are following him. And so the Prophet warned us, we're going to divide and separate, and we're going to be lost to chaos, disputes. People are going to divide into different divisions and sects. If you hold fast to the sunnah, it will be your salvation. That's why he said, hold on like with your teeth, grasp hold. Otherwise, you will be lost and go astray. The sunnah is the difference between being able to implement the Quran and being lost to people's whims and desires. Because the Prophet didn't talk by his hawa or his own whims or desires, but by wahi, by revelation.
Yes, yeah.
Yes?
Sheikh, you told us that the Prophet told Abdullah ibn Amr that write everything you have from me, everything what I'm saying is indeed truth. And you mentioned that sometimes the Prophet forbade the companions to write not to write everything except the Quran from him. So how can we understand these two texts?
Yes. You have to realize the hadiths are real live witnesses of things that happen at different times over 23 years. And actually there's some hadith talking about things even before that, before like the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. And so it might appear to be contradicting it. It actually wasn't. The Prophet said different things to different people according to their situation. So many of the Sahaba couldn't write very well. Some of them knew a little bit, but their memories were very strong. So if the Prophet told them, and they wrote the hadiths, and the Prophet permitted them, and they wrote the hadiths, they wouldn't memorize. Then they might misunderstand their own writing because they weren't very educated. Some of them were very educated, like Abdullah bin Amr and others, who had written documents. And so the Prophet encouraged them to write. Also, at one stage, very few people had learned the Quran. And they were writing the explanation of the Prophet on the same pages with the Quran. So the Prophet didn't want them to mix the Quran and the hadiths. And a very terrible event happened. The Qur'an were the experts in the Quran, who had memorized the Quran and were the experts in the Muslim Ummah. And the kuffar, the enemies of Islam at that time, deceived them and invited them to come and make da'wah and to teach about Islam, and massacred them. And all 70 of them were massacred. And so it was a great trial and test for Islam that many experts of the Quran were lost. So there was a danger that people could confuse the Quran with the hadiths. And so we understand that at that stage, before the text of the Quran was written widely and available to everybody to check, it might be confused. They might be confused between the tafsir and the Quran. Also, Ammar, even later years, he was afraid that people would be so busy learning the hadith, they would neglect the study of the Quran. But the Prophet wrote, he had messages written. He wrote to the governors and the emperors of Rome and Persia and sent his emissaries. Also, he wrote for people basic teachings of Islam and sent to his governors about the zakat. So, for example, he wrote the basic beliefs, the laws, especially zakat, diya, basic things like that about Islam were sent to the different regions of the Islamic State, like to Yemen and Hadramaut and different regions. Also, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had other people write. While Ibn Hajar came and learned Islam from Hadramaut, and then the Prophet sent him back. And so he wrote for him the basic beliefs and practices of Islam about prayers and things, and sent them so he would remember them and teach his people. Also, you have to realize in the era of fitna, when people started fabricating the hadiths and different Islam, there were different divisions. It became very important then to put those in writing so they would not be lost and people couldn't distinguish between what was authentic and what was not, inshallah.
Yes, I have a question, please.
Yes.
Yes, some people say that the main purpose of the hadiths is to explain the Quran. Is this true?
That's one of the purposes. And like we said in a previous episode, Allah sent the Prophet to explain the Quran, but to explain a dhikr. And dhikr, it's a name of the Quran. It means the reminder. But actually, all of the Islamic religion, all of the teaching of Islam is a dhikr. It's the remembrance of Allah's teaching. And so the Prophet came to explain to us Islam in general. But not only that, but we were also told whatever Allah tells us, obey. Whatever the Prophet tells you, obey. And so not everything the Prophet told us is found in a verse of the Quran. So sometimes he explained the meaning of a particular verse. Or sometimes he explained how to do it. Like the word salat in the Quran, it tells us over and again, pray, but it doesn't tell us how to pray. The Prophet showed us how to pray, and he said, pray this way. And the companions saw the Prophet, for example, praying. And they said, we saw the Prophet pray, and this is what he did. Or we saw the Prophet make wudu, to wash before prayer, and this is how he did it. And so the Quran has very detailed description of certain worship. But other worship, it's very, very imprecise. And then there are some things of worship that aren't even found in the Quran at all, and it's only found in the Hadith. But the Hadith are adding to our knowledge by explaining the Quran and supplementing the Quran. And the Hadith are knowledge in themselves because the Prophet was given guidance by Allah. If the Prophet ruled on any matter, for example, people came to him as a judge, he ruled. if the Prophet ruled in some matter and gave an opinion and it was wrong, Allah would have to reveal to the Prophet the correction of his behavior. So if the Prophet ever behaved in any way that was wrong, Allah would remind him of that and tell him, and he would teach us the right thing. And so inshallah, the hadith are a supplement to the Quran, an explanation of the Quran, and they themselves are a source of our Islamic teaching about our beliefs and our practices as Muslims. The Sahaba faithfully memorized the hadith as well as writing them down, and they were very careful. The Prophet was careful to teach them, and they were very careful to learn by his example as well as his words. And so that stage of the Sahaba was the ideal environment to convey knowledge. If Allah desired to convey knowledge to later generations, that was the ideal environment in which to reveal that knowledge to all of us. I hope that this episode has been very beneficial to all of us, and that we will be enlightened and guided by the teachings of the Quran, as well as the Sunnah, the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. May Allah's peace and mercy be upon all of you.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man, sending his word across the land, leading only by his sunnah and the Quran, the word of Allah. He brought the answer to this cruel world, our beloved Prophet Muhammad.